Well, good evening. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm Matthew Clarke, and I come from Sydney in Australia as part of an organisation called Turning Teardrops into Joy. And within that organisation, I'm the principal researcher for the Freedom Keys research project. And I'm going to report on some of the work that we're doing within that project. And the title of my presentation is Reducing the Vulnerability of People to Becoming Traffickers. So I'm grateful to be part of such a large movement with so many people committed to the cause of ending the suffering that's caused by human trafficking in all its forms. There's so much experience and passion and wisdom in this social movement to end human trafficking. And as you realise, human trafficking is a large and complex problem that none of us can solve alone, and so we need each other. There are many important strategies that we've been working on for many years, but the persistence of the problem, despite our best efforts over the last 20 years, indicates that there's a need to try new strategies. And in this session, I focus on one new strategy for us all to consider. I'm going to start by talking about vulnerability in general as part of the human condition, and then look at the Global Slavery Index and what it says about its measures of country-by-country vulnerability to human trafficking. I'm going to talk about the vulnerability of victims, the vulnerability to being abused, exploited and coerced. And then after explaining what I mean by perpetrators of human trafficking, I want to talk about what makes people vulnerable to becoming an abuser, an exploiter, a coercer. And then lastly, we'll look at how we might try to reduce that vulnerability so fewer people become perpetrators. So to start with, I just want to point out that vulnerability is a universal part of human experience. From birth and even before birth, we are dependent on resources beyond our control. We're fragile beings. We're vulnerable to disease, to broken bones, to emotional loss. And yet, choosing to be vulnerable can be the great source of personal growth for many of us. Acknowledging our weaknesses, our fears, our shame, these can be a great inspiration to others. And so the concept of vulnerability has both positive and negative connotations. In the 1940s, Abraham Maslow proposed this hierarchy of human needs. And part of Maslow's idea here is that the lower level needs must be met before a person can even consider the importance or the value of satisfying higher level needs. When needs are not met, people become vulnerable. The idea of forced vulnerability is far removed from that chosen vulnerability that may serve us well when we sit comfortably at one of the higher levels. If someone does not have access to food, to water, warmth, rest, then they cannot survive. They'll do whatever's necessary to meet those needs without concern about their safety or concerns about friendship, loyalty, or self-actualization. People seeking only to survive are fundamentally disempowered in relation to other people, particularly in relation to other people who have the resources that they need to survive. Such people are vulnerable to anyone who they may compete with for the available food, warmth, etc. They also are vulnerable to people who might provide or promise to provide food, warmth, water with strings attached, or in exchange for something that the person struggling to survive can hardly imagine. People who have those physiological needs met at the lowest level of Maslow's hierarchy may then start thinking about the need for safety, for protection from physical harm, for a source of income that allows them to stop worrying about the lower physiological needs. But even in that slightly higher state, able to survive, but physically and psychologically unsafe, they are vulnerable to those who could violate their safety and also to those who could provide their safety at a cost. Now, no doubt there are limitations and flaws in Maslow's model, but this idea is clear. Vulnerability correlates with need. That's this talk's number one tweetable quote. Vulnerability correlates with need. When someone is in need, regardless of what that need is, they are vulnerable to those who might keep the necessary resources from them, as well as to those who might offer the necessary resources but at a cost. Now, moving further than that and talking now a bit more specifically about the human trafficking context, you are probably familiar with the Global Slavery Index. This is the world's best current estimate of the prevalence of modern slavery or human trafficking, which comes from the Walk Free Foundation in Perth. And the Global Slavery Index actually includes three core measurements. It includes the prevalence of modern slavery in each country. It also includes a measure of the vulnerability of each country, which is a risk score based on 23 variables that seek to explain or predict the prevalence of modern slavery in that country. And then the third thing is a measure of the quality of government responses to modern slavery. Now, the 23 risk factors in the vulnerability modelling are listed here, and there's no need to read them all in detail, but you'll see that they're grouped into 5 categories. And so the vulnerability score that the Global Slavery Index allocates to each country can be interpreted in this way. If a country has an inadequate governance of issues such as weapons and political rights, and if it has a lack of meeting basic needs for many of its population, and if that country shows significant inequalities between the people who have access to wealth, those who are affected by crime and who has access to law, and if that country has significant groups of disenfranchised people, and the country also has significant internal conflict, terrorism, displacement, then it will have a high vulnerability score, which indicates the likelihood of a high prevalence of modern slavery in that country. That's the basis of their modelling. Now, to some extent, the factors that contribute to that vulnerability score are only correlated to modern slavery. That is, high vulnerability scores and high prevalence of modern slavery go along with each other. When you see one, you see the other in either direction. But the Global Slavery Index also suggests that those 23 factors help to explain the prevalence of modern slavery. That is, things like internal conflicts, inequality, lack of access to healthcare, political instability, all of those factors are what cause a country to have a high rate of modern slavery. That these 23 factors create vulnerability. Now, the concept of vulnerability is well studied in relation to the victims of human trafficking at the individual level as well, not just this model at the country level. And so there is plenty of research and discussion about what makes a person vulnerable to being abused, exploited, and coerced. And the factors that I'm going to list here are probably reasonably well known to all of you. They're things that a lot of anti-slavery work is based around. Things like poverty. People who are in poverty are more easily taken advantage of because of the desperation of their personal need. Age and gender are an important factor. The majority of human trafficking victims are female and 25% are children. Limited economic and educational opportunities make someone more vulnerable to being exploited. The marginalisation and discrimination that might be based on any of a number of things: ethnicity, race, disability, gender identity, religion. Runaway youth and those in foster care or juvenile detention centres are more at risk of being exploited in the context of human trafficking. Irregular immigration and displacement by political conflict, natural disasters, etc., puts people at risk of being trafficked. Substance abuse is another vulnerability factor that we can identify ahead of time that makes people vulnerable to being exploited, as is the being a survivor of past abuse. People who are abused once are more likely to be vulnerable to being abused again. And of course there may be other factors, but these are the common ones that the anti-trafficking movement is aware of that are predictors of people being vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced. Now, 3 years ago, I published an article called Perpetrator-Centric Strategies for Addressing Modern Slavery, and I've given the reference here on the slide. It's available in both English and Indonesian. And the central claim of this article was that unless we understand and engage with perpetrators, the problem of modern slavery or human trafficking will not be resolved. Let me read that again because it is such a core claim. That unless we understand and engage with perpetrators, the problem of human trafficking or modern slavery will not be resolved. The article notes that to end modern slavery, we need to change the behaviour of perpetrators. Now, that does not mean that other approaches are wrong. Human trafficking is not just one problem. There are many challenges across a very broad range of forms of trafficking, and so no single approach will solve all of those challenges. Strategies that focus on victims and survivors are very important, but I'm suggesting that not enough attention has been paid to the perpetrator side of the problem. In the journal article, I suggest that the concept of vulnerability can be applied to perpetrators in much the same way as it has been applied to victims and survivors. We'll consider what vulnerability means when applied to perpetrators soon, but first I just want to clarify what I mean by this label perpetrator. First of all, I want to emphasise that a perpetrator is a person with moral agency. They are a person who perpetrates a variety of abuses, exploitation and coercion. The label perpetrator does not identify the person completely. Just as the terms victim or survivor does not define a person completely. They are one aspect of the person who has agency. Now, second, in this paper, I suggested a matrix that listed 3 different types of perpetrators based on the role that they play. I suggested that the work of understanding and engaging with perpetrators is too large for one organisation, too much for any one group or one strategy to address, and so the matrix subdivides this huge task about what the anti-trafficking movement could be working on into a collaborative space with 12 subtasks. You'll notice along the top I've listed 3 types of perpetrators: the slaveholders and controllers, who are the people who are in the presence of the coerced person who is actively abusing, coercing and exploiting that person. They think to some extent that they own the person and can do what they want to that person. Traffickers per se and marketers are slightly different. The word trafficker suggests movement, and so some traffickers transport people from one place to another so that other people can abuse them. They don't themselves directly abuse, they traffic people into a situation where they are abused, coerced and exploited. They run a marketplace for people. And then thirdly, I've mentioned consumers, because the people who consume the goods and services produced by abused, coerced and exploited people are themselves the ones who generate the demand and perpetuate the problem. Some consumers are directly in front of the person being abused. They can see and know what's going on. Other consumers are several steps back in the supply chain. but consumers at whatever distance from the abuse are perpetrators in the sense that their action produces the demand that leads to the abuse, exploitation and coercion of the victim. Now, this presentation is a contribution to the second row of this matrix, prevention. And so my core question is, what makes people vulnerable to becoming a perpetrator, and how might we prevent it? Let's look at the first question there. What makes people vulnerable to becoming a perpetrator? We need to understand this if we wish to reduce that vulnerability. If we wish that less people became a perpetrator, it's important to understand why they become a perpetrator in the first place. Perhaps a common assumption is that some people are just evil. Another assumption may be that the core driver is greed. I believe the reality is more complex and nuanced than either of those claims, and that a whole range of factors that make people vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced also apply to the vulnerability of people to becoming abusive, exploitative and coercive. I'll repeat that because it's an important point. The whole range of factors that make people vulnerable to being abused, exploited and coerced also make people vulnerable to being abusers, exploiters and coercers. So there's a complex set of factors that contribute to making a person vulnerable. We've listed some already: poverty, marginalisation, lack of work opportunities, lack of education, substance abuse, etc. Together, those varying and interacting factors form a sort of ecology, what I call a motivational ecology. Some of those factors are internal and psychological, while others are external and situational. And as with any ecology, all of these elements interact in complex ways, reinforcing each other, forming a system that can be difficult to disrupt. So then, how might we disrupt that vulnerability? How might we change the system to reduce people's propensity for becoming perpetrators? I'm going to suggest some ways that work in two different spaces. One is to decrease the external contributing factors that push people into situations where it seems a good idea to become a perpetrator. And the second is to increase people's inner resources, their resilience, so that the person is not under the control of those negative external factors. Let's look more closely at the likely external elements, and then I'll look at the likely internal elements. Now, I must be clear that there's been so little study of this topic that the specifics on the next few slides are speculative. They seem reasonable to me and to others I've discussed them with, but they haven't arisen from empirical studies. That evidence is yet to be gathered. Let's look at some external factors. It's likely that the same systemic interventions that we use for reducing the vulnerability of people becoming victims will have an impact on people becoming traffickers. So reducing poverty will reduce the body of people who think that abusing, coercing and exploiting others is a meaningful and perhaps necessary survival mechanism. Cultural changes that affirm the dignity and rights of all, special consideration for people on the margins of social care, providing safe migration routes, reducing political conflict, providing access to basic needs, housing, food, security, etc., providing meaningful employment and other money-generating opportunities. Interventions that reduce those factors will reduce how easily people can be taken advantage of, but they will also reduce the need for people whose own survival drives them to take advantage of others. Secondly, there will be flow-on effects effects from addressing the country level vulnerability factors. So if we work at a country level on improving governance, on allowing a government services and an economy which provides basic needs, reducing inequality, caring for disenfranchised groups, reducing the effects of conflicts, those factors are powerful external drivers that create opportunities for abuse. And so to remove those factors will enable people to be less tempted or able to exploit others. The third bullet point on here is to reverse the balance of a high return, low risk opportunity to becoming low return and high risk. Now, like all of us, criminals do not act completely rationally, but nevertheless, consciously or unconsciously, they no doubt weigh up costs and benefits. If the benefits are not attractive enough, money, social status, whatever, we won't bother trying. If the costs are too high, either financial or the risk of social stigma or the risk of legal punishment, we'll also become less likely to act. So what could we do to reduce expectations of a return? The Global Fund to End Modern Slavery used to have the tagline, "Making slavery unprofitable." They've moved on since those days, but it's an interesting slogan. And it works when profit is the motive. So for those forms of modern slavery where the reason people engage in it is to generate money for themselves, then making slavery unprofitable financially will no doubt reduce the prevalence of the action. In cases where the return is not financial but perhaps social status, then cultural change can make a difference. So suppose that you live in a culture where giving your daughter to marry a richer, older man results in your own family gaining social status and influence. Then the likelihood that you would do that to your own daughter would reduce if the surrounding cultural acceptance of the practice of forced marriage was changed. If community pressure supporting forced marriage became community pressure that emphasised the value of young women and their autonomy, then the so-called reward of increased social status would be reduced and people would be less likely to do it. So that's about reducing the expectations of return. What about increasing the perceived risk or the perceived cost? We could, of course, strengthen laws and law enforcement to increase the threat of punishment. And I would say that in the last 20 years, this is one of the anti-trafficking movement's primary approaches. However, there's little evidence that this deterrence assumption works, except perhaps if people perceive that the likelihood of being caught is very high. There is very little evidence, very little research, in fact, that has been done in whether deterrence works in the context of human trafficking crimes. We could, however, do other things to increase the costs of human trafficking operations. This is what social movement theory calls disruption costs. How do we intervene within the system to make the costs to the traffickers or other perpetrators too high for their like? For instance, collective action by unions and other worker-based organisations about fair pay and safe work conditions. If we, as an anti-trafficking movement, assisted and mobilised unions and worker-based organisations to be more vocal with their bosses, that could increase the cost to the people who are taking advantage of them and generate change within that system. We could make it difficult to supply products unless you have some certification about fair employment conditions. There are various certification schemes like that I'm sure you're aware of. But let's suppose in the coffee industry, for instance, suppose that McDonald's decided that they would renew their contracts for the supply of coffee beans, not purely based on the lowest cost, but on suppliers who could convincingly show that they were free of exploitation. Then that would put pressure on all of the potential suppliers of coffee to adjust their business model so that they could get contracts for the sale of their goods. So there are ways to change the structure to pressure people to change their actions. Lastly, on this slide, other job prospects and meaningful opportunities for making money are helpful alternatives. People would be less likely to abuse, exploit and coerce if they had other options, if there were other ways of making money, if there were other ways of gaining status, if there were other ways of gaining control in their lives. This is especially true for those who themselves are in vulnerable positions where they are just trying to survive. So much for external factors. What about internal factors in the motivational ecology? I've listed 3 here, and we'll say a little bit about each of these. One thing we could be doing more of as the anti-trafficking movement is developing people's knowledge through education in general, because education itself reduces people's vulnerability because it gives them options and the ability to make more choices. But education about human trafficking in particular might be helpful. For instance, simply education about the laws and the threat of punishment, because there's certainly some evidence that people who are convicted of trafficking offences were unaware that what they were doing was illegal. And of course, there is no way that a law can deter people if people are not aware of the law or the threat of punishment. So educating people about that is an important factor in reducing people's likelihood to choose that path of action. Developing people's empathy is also important. We might wonder what has happened to them, the perpetrator, that they don't care about the suffering of another. How could they do that? We often ask ourselves. Do they not know that they are abusing, exploiting, coercing, and damaging their victims? If it is that they don't know, then what type of intervention might teach them about the consequences of their action? If it's lack of awareness, there is further education to raise their empathy for the damage that they're causing. Or do they know but don't care? In that case, they need psychological help. How is it that we can help them to rechannel the needs that they have so that they recognise the damage that they are doing to others and find other ways of meeting their needs that can be achieved without the damage to another person? So there's a couple of ways there to develop empathy, depending on whether the lack of empathy is based on knowledge or willful ignorance. I've also written here values, by which I mean processes of building people's early values, the formation of early values in children. Asking children before they make such important life decisions, such as do I become a trafficker or not, what kind of person do you want to grow up to be? And from a young age, drawing out the best of people. Do you want to grow up to be a protector of those around you, or will you grow up to be a predator who preys on the vulnerabilities of those around you? A life in which you flourish does not have to be at the expense of someone else. We can all flourish together. If that was part of early values education, then perhaps people would be more resilient against the temptations to abuse, exploit and coerce for their own gain. I'll mention a few examples. First, consider a slave controller Consider somebody who is selling videos of their child through live stream sexual abuse to a remote and anonymous viewer who is paying for you to abuse your child on camera. Now in the Philippines, this is a growing marketplace, the online sexual exploitation of children, and the police in the Philippines report that about 70% of people who are abused in this way are abused by close relatives, parents, older siblings, cousins. Now, in terms of external factors, if we were to lift the burden of poverty so that a $20 payment from a paedophile in the USA or Australia was not an attractive offer to that person in the Philippines, then if they had other employment opportunities, if they weren't so much in survival mode themselves because of their extreme poverty, then they might not put their younger sibling in front of that web camera for a mere $20. And in terms of the internal factors, it might be that they're not fully aware, or their rationalizations create a blind spot so that they don't allow themselves to be aware that the abuse for a young child will continue to have long-term psychological effects into their adulthood. And so maybe there's an educational component to help those people who are the slave controller in front of the webcam deciding not to do what they're doing because of the damage that they know it will do to their child. As another example from the marketing point of view, suppose we have a recruitment agent who charges a fee for workers and has no real interest in their welfare after the placement. Suppose this recruitment agent is bringing people from overseas with a promise of a good job in a richer country and a promise that they'll earn plenty of money to send back to their family to raise their family out of poverty. But once they get into that job, they might be badly exploited by their new bosses to the point where their freedom is taken away, they are abused and exploited beyond our understanding. And the recruitment agent has no interest in what happens after they've gathered their fee. Well, we could introduce external pressure in the form that I mentioned before by raising up and encouraging recruitment companies that can do the same job without exploiting people and to make a profitable business from it. And there, the economic pressure will be that all of these successful companies get return customers because they treat people fairly, and yet the company still makes a profit for their shareholders. And so the companies that are doing things in exploitative ways lose their business because nobody will come back to them. They will lose money and lose the incentive to continue operating. They will either go out of business or they will change their ways to be more like the ones that aren't exploiting. Internally, it may be that we can sit down with the people who are acting as recruitment agents and put in front of them someone who has been one of their victims to help them to see the real damage that was done by the person that they placed in a role that ended up being a form of modern slavery. As a third example, let's consider a consumer, a sex tourist or so-called sex tourist, someone who goes out of their country to find illicit opportunities for sex, often with minors. Now, an external factor that might reduce that type of behaviour is the criminalisation of sex buying. Now, I know there are arguments for and against that, but I'm pointing out that it is one strategy which can reduce the demand side by changing the behaviour of the consumer. Changing cultural messaging about what's acceptable might be another approach. Challenging the negative sexualisation of children through advertising. Public awareness campaigns about consent might be another way of addressing that part as an external intervention to reduce demand. On the internal side, again, we can be doing something to raise empathy, hearing the real stories of how the prostituted women the sex tourist might encounter, how they were coerced or tricked into being there, dispelling the myth that they were happy. Developing within those people some more inner strength to resist the peer pressure and other temptations to engage in that activity, providing other healthier options for their sexuality. Now, as far as I know, some of these, but not all of these, have already been attempted. I think it's time for the anti-trafficking movement as a whole to be more intentional about implementing this type of intervention that targets perpetrators. We need to try them and evaluate their effectiveness. My guess is that we would find a result something like this curve, which shows how difficult it might be to change perpetrator behaviour. So along the x-axis here we have cases where it is very simple to change people, to stop them being traffickers or other perpetrators, and on the right-hand extreme, people who are so embedded that they are unlikely to change. And on the y-axis, the number of people who meet this condition. And so I would imagine that there is a body of people who are already seeking help to stop doing what they're doing. And any intervention that gave them another opportunity would be sufficient to stop them doing the abuse, exploitation and coercion of others. There's another group of people who, with some work, would be willing to change if they were convinced that there was another opportunity that brought them as much money or as much social status as they needed. There's another group who would be resistant to change, who for one reason or another don't believe that there is another alternative, or who like doing what they're doing. And sure, at the extreme end, there are some people who might be immovable. There are people who are so intransigent that we might be wasting our time even trying to change. Now, I'm not sure whether this curve is skewed one way or the other, and no idea where the borders are between these four groups, but it's a good bet that the curve would be something like this. And we tend to think that all the perpetrators are over the right-hand edge and that they'll never change. But we shouldn't allow the people at the right-hand edge to prevent us working with the people who are the majority and who are on the left-hand edge, where any assistance would lead to a rapid change. So my challenge is that there are already programs that seek to reduce the vulnerability of people to becoming victims. They are laudable, and they are well established and have strong networks throughout countries where there is a high prevalence of modern slavery. My challenge is that those very programs should be extended so that they include at least a topic about the vulnerability of people becoming perpetrators. So if you have any programs already in place that seek to reduce vulnerability, consider how they might apply to the potential perpetrators as well. In closing, the Freedom Keys research project has generated many ideas in this space that are as yet untested. And if you're working in this space, we would love to work with partners to help design interventions along the lines of what I've presented here tonight, to help the whole anti-trafficking movement to understand the behaviours of traffickers and consumers more deeply, and to work with you to design interventions that seek to engage with the perpetrators so that we can change their behaviours, and through changing their behaviours, bring the system of human trafficking to an end. You can find out more about our work at our website, turningteardropsintojoy.com, or you can email me at the address on the screen.